Good evening and welcome to another event at the York Festival of Ideas. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this fascinating event. My name's Joan Concannon and I'm lucky enough to be the director of York Festival of Ideas. I'm a serial addict when it comes to buying cookery books and reading columns about food, so I'm absolutely delighted this evening to have two such stalwart people to talk to about this. Before we move on to the introductions and the event itself, let me just run through a few technical details. First of all, if you lose any power, just come back in on the link that you came in on to join the event in the first place. The Q&A button at the bottom of your screen is on all through, so do post questions all the way along. The event will run in the series of a conversation initially, and then we hope to have lots of questions from all of you. If you require the live transcript, again, at the bottom of your screen, just click on or off, dependent on your requirements, the CC Live Transcript button. This event is being recorded, and so it will also be posted in a couple of days' time on our Watch Again York Ideas platform. So do please tell everyone about that as well. And then finally, it's my enormous pleasure to welcome Felicity Cloake and Samuel Goldsmith. For somebody who grew up in a decade where you were still quite likely to be offered grapefruit or a glass of orange juice as a starter if you went out to a restaurant, and certainly in my own case, growing up in Northeast Galway, the only olive oil for purchase anywhere within a 50-mile radius was from a rather scary septuagenarian chemist in our local village who doled it out for earache and for nothing else. I think it's fair to say we have seen quite a seismic shift in our approach to food and recipes. So Felicity Cloake will be well known to many of you for her fabulous and go-to column, How to Make the Perfect, and frankly, just about anything after that. She's the author of 7 books, including most recently, and I'm just reading my way through, the sublime Red Sauce, Brown Sauce. Obviously, I have an opinion. She is also a member of the Food Writers Guild, and she and Samuel were out rather late last night for a guild a guild event. Samuel is also a commander of platforms in terms of food and culture because he oversees BBC Good Food Platform. He is a food editor, a food stylist of long-standing, contributes to a range of digital and magazine formats, and has also worked as a food stylist, which I'm mini to major fascinated by as well. So without further ado, thank you, Felicity and Sam, for being here this evening. And let's kick off with a fairly obvious question is, how did you end up with such fantastically interesting jobs in terms of shaping what the rest of the nation thinks is a really good idea to cook on a weeknight or over the weekend?
I think for me, my answer is the truth, which is that I've always been really greedy. And I've always liked eating. And obviously, if you like eating, then you sort of have to learn to cook, because especially when you're a student, you don't have the money to go out and things. So I remember doing a lot of experimenting with cookery as a student. And, I realized that it's got what I love about the food world is that it encompasses everything from sort of, you can look into the chemistry of cooking, you can look into history, politics, recipes are basically chemistry and sort of, exploring different cultures around the world and things. So there's everything. Food covers absolutely everything. I can't think of a subject that doesn't include food in some way. And so that's how I got into it. And I do feel really lucky. I have to apologize to everyone that I'm at quite a strange angle, just to explain. I'm in a park. So that's why you're getting a very unflattering angle of me. I do have a chin, I promise.
Trees are thoroughly lovely, and we'll take great speakers from, frankly, any location. Sam, how did you get into this?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess it was a more traditional route, but my family were always really into food. My grandfather he trained as a patisserie chef, and my dad owned a cafe, like a sort of, to be fair, it was a bit of a greasy spoon. And then actually my grandfather said, do not under any circumstances go into food because it's a terrible living. But for him, I think he probably meant more kitchens. I hope so anyway, otherwise he'll be incredibly ashamed of me. And then, I actually became a teacher first. And then after, or sort of during teaching, that's when I started doing the food styling and kind of assisting people. And then I decided as a 30th birthday present to myself to quit teaching. And then I went into food media sort of full time. And more down the editorial route. And for magazines and websites.
And was there ever a moment that either of you contemplated going down the chefing route, or was that they come with quite a reputation, it has to be said?
No, I have done a couple of stints, when I say stints, like days in a professional kitchen for various things. And actually, I did the Great British Menu several years ago, and that involves, for the final banquet, pairing of one of the winning chefs and helping them out. I mean, I say helping because I was no help at all, helping this poor guy break down entire goat carcasses. I was a liability. But I just realised it's such hard physical work, and it was fascinating, but it wouldn't be. I mean, I'm far too old to do it now as well, but it wouldn't be for me. I'm in awe of them, but I'm very happy cooking in my own kitchen. I don't think that the restaurant world has lost great talent with me.
It's really hard work. I did it for about 2 or 3 years, weekends after teaching. So I'd leave my school on a Friday and then drive down to Somerset to a bed and breakfast and cook for Friday night dinner and Saturday night dinner. And it was exhausting, but it was fun. And there's lots of stories that you learn that obviously you'd never share. But yeah, I think I couldn't do it full time. I'd be awful. I'd probably wake up crying every day.
It's astonishing watching, and particularly restaurants where there's a Portuguese bar that we absolutely adore in London, and it's one of those tiny places where you sit at the counter and there's a guy who's basically seems to be juggling entirely in his head a set of multiple timings and never seems to put a foot wrong. And I just think how many layers of his brain that he can run so many parallel sets of timings for really precise cookery over a Josper oven that is a furnace. It's absolutely extraordinary watching those people work. But I'm really interested in exploring further the world of recipes and cookery writing and how it inspires people from the context of that difference between having an entire kitchen brigade you can bark at, do this, do that, relative to making somebody feel really comfortable in their own kitchen. I can do this. At what stage did you feel, or was there a kind of turning point in either of your thinking about writing about food where you thought, I'm really adding something here, I'm helping people? Was it feedback that people were giving you, or how did you feel like you had hit a moment where this was really working for you?
I think for me, it came because I used to work for food magazines like Sam before I became just a freelance writer. And one of the things that I really enjoyed actually was editing recipes. So quite often they would come in from professional chefs, and they weren't suitable for home kitchens and the audience that we were working for. So it was my job to make them accessible. And because I'm not a trained chef, I've had no formal cookery training at all, I found it quite easy to put myself in the reader's shoes and it's like a puzzle to try and work out what they mean and how to translate that to the home kitchen, and always trying to think, is there a point in washing up that pan, or actually could you use that for something else, and which wouldn't be a concern in a professional kitchen because, as you say, there's someone there to give you a new pan and etc. But I really enjoyed putting that perspective onto recipes. But I still, when I came to write recipes myself, found it absolutely terrifying. It seemed very presumptuous that I was issuing instructions with no formal training. But then, having interviewed lots of chefs now, I realised that increasingly they don't have formal training. A lot of people that are setting up restaurants now just have the passion. And, I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but it's anyone that's watching that is interested in getting certainly into food writing, I can say that people do courses because it makes them feel more confident, but you definitely don't need to. You just need to be able to if you want to do recipes, to be able to cook, but also be able to put yourself in the shoes of the reader and to write that down in an accessible way. But it still blows my mind that I can order people around on a page. It's a very odd feeling.
I think there's something in bringing confidence as well to people, and especially having been a teacher, you'd start the class and you knew that some people they're fine with it, they'll do it. And maybe it's a kind of arrogance, I don't know. I think sometimes it's a bit of insecurity that comes across like that. But I think for me, it's that you're allowing somebody to create something, and hopefully that will work perfectly. And yeah, I think it's definitely moving from food styling into food writing and recipe writing. It's a lot more. It's a lot different because you don't really get judged on your food styling. Well, obviously, people probably do say stuff at home, but in the same way that now you've got comments, you've got, certainly online, people rating it, and with Instagram, people tag you and say, I made this and this didn't work, or
it's a whole other world, the commentary. I'm always fascinated by the below the line comments around what seems to me sometimes people ignoring everything that you've put. I mean, even to the point of alternative ingredients that are so materially different from the recipe itself. You think, that's very lovely that you've done that, but it actually isn't now the thing that Felicity or Samuel have published. What was the point of that, other than does it annoy you when people screw around with your recipes that much?
Doesn't it annoy me, because quite often it's something I find that criticism below the line, it's quite often constructive. And if someone says, I made your soda bread, but I needed to make it gluten-free for a celiac friend, so I did that and it works really well, that is brilliant, because that is adding, all recipes in my opinion are just sort of building on what's come before. There really is very little new, completely new under the sun, unless you're someone like Heston, and quite often even he has got sort of historical sources that he's building on. So I think that's all part of the recipe writing process. I think the difficult thing is when people say that it didn't work and they've made changes, and that can be a bit frustrating, because they're giving it a bad rating and you're thinking, well, you didn't really follow the instructions here, did you? So in general, I love the fact there's feedback, because prior to that, I can remember, Sam probably can't, but I can remember when there was no, maybe a reader would write a letter in if they had a real disaster with something, but other than that, there was just silence. And now to be able to get instant feedback on something and to see very easily people making your recipes, it's really gratifying. It really gives me joy, apart from the odd occasion when, as I say, things go wrong, and then I'm thinking, what have they done here? Why have I explained this wrong, that they haven't quite got what I meant to convey?
There's a definite buzz to it, isn't there? I think when the positive feedback, I think when I worked at Women's Weekly, because it was a much older audience, we had a lot of letters and emails. But I think it's even, when you get a positive letter, it's even better than like a comment or a star rating, because it takes effort. I think a lot of people will only write something when they've got something negative to say. So bring back the letter.
Even if it's in green ink, you are brave. So that's quite interesting, actually. One final question on the construction of recipes around that. And perhaps it is a progression thing, where there will be certain recipe writers or cookery writers that gently send someone down the slipway into making them feel that they can actually do this. And then there's a sort of breed of writers which I'm inordinately fond of, which is giving you almost a blueprint and a framework, but within which you can do a bit of freewheeling. Where do you see yourself sitting in that spectrum of, do you really like when people come back to give you feedback to say, well, I didn't have X, or I thought it would be really interesting to add something else entirely, not just for kind of dietary reasons, but has that kind of then inspired you to kind of go back and look at recipes again, or are you thoroughly annoyed that they have taken your beautiful recipe and bowdlerized it?
As I said, I love it, particularly when it's a dish that is not something, because there'll be lots of recipes you can only really be familiar with a couple of cultures depending on your heritage, and people saying, actually, this is how they make it in a different part of that country, or this is how my grandma made it, or whatever. I find that absolutely fascinating, and that's not always true of recipes from the other side of the world. You can be doing a Lancashire butter pie and someone will say, oh, that's not how it's done in Pendle, or something like that, and you just get this little snapshot. So no, I'm really pleased with feedback like that in general, and especially when someone veganizes my recipe or whatever. It's just, it feels very collaborative, which I like.
And sometimes I'll put a twist on it that I think you want to try yourself as well. So you'll go home and maybe make it in that way. I think it's nice that they have the confidence to do that with one of your recipes, but I think that's probably because that person's a confident cook already. Or it can take time to get to that place, and they probably haven't just followed one of us. They'll have used a multitude of cookery writers to get to that point.
So you've both had experience of working for different outlets, and you were mentioning, was it Women and Home? It's not something that I read. Perhaps I haven't reached the age point yet. Do you find yourself consciously being audience led, or do you want to kind of push them into something a bit more adventurous? What is the process by which you can identify? And I guess also the helicopter view that two of you must have on trending ingredients or dishes. I'm thinking of your example in the book, Felicity, of the avocado toast moment, where you have decided it's over. I'm not sure anyone in York is quite cottoned on to the fact it's over yet.
I only said it was over because Wetherspoons have taken it off the menu, and I felt like when it got to Wetherspoons, obviously that is a huge, I think, nationwide chain.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Oh yeah.
And the fact that they were doing avocado toast, I'm like, okay, it's not just the hipster cafes and places like York and Manchester and London. It is very much like it'll be on the breakfast menu all over the country. But I think that I only realised quite recently that it is quite problematic in terms of sustainability and the economics involved for the people that actually grow those avocados traditionally for their own diets. And so I have tried to weed myself off avocados, which is difficult because I absolutely love them. And I feel quite peeved in this sort of awful way, because I remember I went on, I think one of my first ever press trips, not quite the first one, I went with the avocado growers of Chile to see avocados being grown. And this was back in the days before the financial crash, where they would fly a load of journalists over to see these things. And before, I'm sure we should have been worrying about the environment in those days, but we weren't. And it blew my mind, because I grew up with avocados being a sort of very crunchy, almost green thing that you only really got with maybe vinaigrette in, or frozen prawns, etc. And suddenly to go somewhere where the avocados are really ripe and yellow and you can spread them like butter was incredible. And then sort of 7 years later, you're seeing Wetherspoons. So I'm like, how did that happen? Sorry, I'm in a park and there's a lot of dogs. So yes, and anyway, the avocado I've got very mixed feelings about, but I don't think I'm not sure. Maybe makes me sound like a wally to say it's over, doesn't it? Sorry.
Well, no, it's interesting because you see these trends every now and again, particularly for some ingredients, and then the power of cookery writers to shift something off a supermarket shelf in significant quantities when a recipe takes off. Is really interesting.
The Delia effect, I think, used to be known as the supermarkets will really stock up.
My own personal one, and certainly after Nigella's last book, I am now buying my own body weight on a regular basis in Aleppo pepper, which I'd literally never heard of until
exactly.
She was
or it's like the Ottolenghi. The Ottolenghi book suddenly will introduce you to 5 core ingredients, and you're like, oh God, why do I not have these already? How embarrassing. It's such an interesting window into another world, isn't it?
I think it does, as you were asking, it does depend on audience. I think like Woman in Home and Woman's Weekly were very different to BBC Good Food. I think with Woman in Home, our thing was always like twists on a classic, and Woman's Weekly was different again. Whereas with BBC Good Food, we're there to educate as well, I think, and also drive those trends to people's homes, but in a way in which they'll want to cook them, rather than some food writers will use 100 different ingredients, that trend being one of them. So I think it's about showing it off, but in a way that will make them want to cook it at home.
So that education piece is really interesting, because Sam, you were a teacher for 10 years. Felicity, you've done some work around food and obesity. How much do you think about the educative aspects in terms of healthy eating, and particularly, I suppose, children, and also the idea of a recipe encouraging children to try something out for themselves? Not every school has the equipment to be able to help children think about food in the way that we might like. Is there more that can be done to kind of inspire people?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. I think there's probably a generation, if not more, of people that aren't confident cooks because they weren't really taught properly, and actually their parents might not have been taught properly either. If said properly is not really the right word, but in many cases taught at all. And I think that's why we're seeing that reliance on processed food, and I think that's kind of what is encouraging unhealthy habits. But I kind of you can't blame anyone for that, because it's so easy to do, and I'm guilty of it myself sometimes too. I think it's it's great when people are inspired to cook, and it's great when kids do it off their own back as well. And at BBC Good Food, we've started a series called Kids Kitchen, which is to encourage parents to teach their children. I guess also to encourage children to sort of nag their parents into teaching them to cook. But I don't think we've probably got enough time to work out what the answer is.
Yeah, I think one of the key things, because we occasionally do things, particularly during the school holidays, we'll have the supplement that I'm in, and The Guardian is called Feast, and we'll have a Cooking with Kids sort of special edition. And it's so easy to fall into that trap of thinking that it has to be sort of chocolate crispy cakes or, something sweet, and actually more useful and, potentially as interesting to kids is learning to cook the things that actually they really like to eat for dinner. And, whether that's sort of, but they've got very sophisticated palates or, and they want to make their own. I was talking to an 8-year-old last night at the event who's won a young food writer competition that we'd put on. And she's talking that she and her mum had made wild garlic pesto with wild garlic from the garden. And I'm not sure she said she enjoyed eating it, but she definitely enjoyed making it. Or whether it's that, or whether it's something like making your own chicken nuggets or whatever, or looking into like the best way to do sweet potato chips in the oven or whatever. So it can be sort of things that are fun to eat, but don't necessarily need to be, super sugary. And I do think that we have a responsibility as cookery writers to change the narrative there and to make children's cooking more than just melted chocolate, basically.
I think there is an element as well, and I don't know how much you pay attention to, almost with a small p, politicization of food in the context of various movements that come and go, clean food, slow food, naked food, veganism, so on and so forth. And everything's got merit, but I suppose sometimes the kind of way in which those particular movements present themselves can be quite scary for people who don't know very much about food, full stop. It's quite often framed in a negative of don't do this, that, and the other, rather than actually you might want to try this, that, and the other. Do you? And I noticed, but both of your platforms have been much more diverse in both, not just the use of ingredients, but also different movements. Are you seeing positive reactions from that more diverse? Particularly in the context of what you said earlier, around sustainability and the kinds of foods, and now with the cost of living, cheaper food and the ability to create recipes that really engage people and inspire them?
I think you're right that it's unhelpful. Sometimes the way that these diets or ways of eating are presented can be very unhelpful, because it's sort of presented as a binary. You're either completely vegan or you're not. And actually, the way to get people to eat, eat pure animal products is to sort of introduce it more gradually. And it's very giving up anything, and it's quite a big deal. So I think that we found that just doing more recipes that suit those particular diets is the way to go. And The Guardian actually for a long time has been very conscious of things like sustainable seafood, and we now run very few, for example, beef recipes. So trying to be a little bit more conscious of that. And actually for me as a cookery writer, I find it fascinating to try and adapt traditional recipes to these new diets. And you always get the people below the line that are like, what's the point? I've been doing a vegan carbonara recipe this week, and it's one of the most fun weeks that I've done for ages, because people saying, oh, why do you bother? Carbonara is just eggs and meat. But that's not to say, I'm not saying it is a traditional carbonara, but trying to recreate that flavor profile and that richness without using animal products was a really interesting challenge for me. And as someone that does love traditional carbonara, I feel like the result actually I was really happy with, which surprised me. So I think it's a good thing, just for our own mental stimulation, but generally for people to realize that you don't have to be always, you can dip in and out of those things. And the cost of living, I think, is going to necessarily persuade us that not only are we going to have to think about sustainability, but we are going to have to think about not turning the oven on. And I think that I don't have a microwave because my kitchen is so small. I actually don't have room for one, and I'm thinking I might need to find some room somewhere. I don't know what I'm going to give up, but a microwave, the dogs actually live on the kitchen counter. But just because I do think that that's going to be an increasing issue for food writers, that we are going to have to think more about things like that again. And we've had this sort of golden period, certainly where I've been working, where yes, sustainability was the thing, but people weren't, and it's not like we were doing caviar and sort of fillet steak and things, but thinking more about the cost of ingredients, but also fuel. So yeah, that's a challenge that is a bit grimmer really than veganizing things.
Yeah, we've got a new campaign called Cook Smart, which is about that, about helping with the cost of living crisis. And it's not just about affordable ingredients, but also, if you're going to put your oven on, then don't just cook one thing, try and cook a range of things. And it's not, there's so many things you can do. And I think, we're going to need to look at that even further. But I think the point you make, Felicity, about it's the not labeling it, I think, which helps. If not to say this is a vegetarian whatever. I think if you just make something and it's a delicious recipe and it entices people into cooking it, I think sometimes actually that vegan label and the vegetarian label can put people off.
Yeah, certainly. But yeah, people that don't follow those diets all the time.
Yeah.
If you say, vegan chili sin carne, then they're like, oh, I don't want that. It sounds horrible. Whereas if you say it's a bean chili, they're like, oh, that sounds nice.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just about thinking of ways to persuade, to present things that make them more attractive to more people without being too didactic. So obviously this is recipes, but I do think we have a responsibility to think about the influence that we're exerting.
Although at Women's Weekly, they loved it, actually. They loved a vegan and a vegetarian and a gluten-free.
Excellent.
Interesting.
So tell me about the mysteries of food styling, Samuel. Speaking of influencing and making things look very attractive, there's always the kind of mythologizing about the things that you paint food so that they show up well in photographs. Is any of that true?
It used
is
to
anything
be
edible after you finish photographing it?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's definitely edible and it's definitely gets eaten. Years ago, when I was at university, we did a module on food styling. The food stylist we had there had done ice cream by painting plasticine. It wasn't actually ice cream. And then when I went to work for Jamie Oliver, I did an internship there, and their food stylist, Ginny, she had been the first person to actually take a photograph of actual ice cream, which obviously was a bit of a nightmare because it kept melting under the heat. But I'm not sure that, I don't know if there's really a secret. I think years ago it was quite fake. I remember watching a documentary, sort of like an episode, a short on Channel 4, and it was like the life of somebody who does a certain job, and this one was a food stylist, and they made a chicken pie by putting cotton wool in, put the pastry over, baked it, cut the pastry out, took the cotton wool out, tipped the chicken pie in. And sometimes we do fake stuff. I remember once, not with BBC Good Food actually, with someone else, we had a turkey and it didn't cook in time, so we just tipped loads of hot oil over it to make it look brown, and it was raw, but no one would know. But now we do try and cook the recipe properly and then just sort of make it look nice at the end. It's a real art, and I have to say I'm definitely not one of the best ones out there. So that's why I'm not doing it anymore. There's lots of talented people that just make the food look absolutely delicious.
But it is so interesting.
Sorry, Felicity, go on.
I was going to say, I find it so interesting that now a lot of people, including me, do take photographs of their food just at home, and you find yourself, I find myself approaching the food in a different way. So I'm thinking, oh, that's a bit sort of, it's very brown. Maybe I'll stick some chili flakes on top. Maybe I'll stick some herbs. Yeah. Maybe I'll stick the old favourite, the fried egg, because everyone loves the fried egg. And actually, I think, step back. It doesn't need this. This is just, if you are, obviously, if you're putting it in a magazine or restaurant, then you do have to think about the eye of the customer. But I do think it's pernicious to this sort of aesthetics first approach, where you are thinking how it looks rather than whether all of these ingredients are necessary, because sometimes, certainly in magazines and cookbooks, you can just disregard the garnishes because they look great, but you kind of know that they're not going to add anything to the dish. But it's interesting that if you look at cookbooks from, say, the 80s and 90s, they're much more, the styling is much neater, whereas now, it's very fashionable to sort of have crumbs or drips or whatever. It's, a hand coming in, a bit of movement, as they call it. It's just, I guess it comes in trends, and soon we might be back to sort of the 80s very precision styling soon. But it is interesting looking how much that dates a cookbook. If you look at a cookbook from 30 years ago, it looks impossibly dated, but the recipes are probably great. It's just that what excited the eye then does not excite the eye now.
It is hard. True. Sorry.
I have a Marguerite Patton book I bought in an Oxfam shop years ago from the late 1950s. And her recipe for gingerbread is just brilliant. But the book itself and the imagery, little though there is, and the whole way that the recipes are written feels like a completely different era.
Yeah, and you do, if you look at some of the really classic cookbooks, people like Jane Grigson and Elizabeth David, there are line drawings or perhaps no drawings at all, and people are put off by that because we're now very used to seeing representations of the food, which is a shame, because actually, A, the recipes are great for the most part, but B, you have a freedom there to style that dish and make that dish look as you imagine it, as opposed to slavishly copying the picture. And I do think we have, even though I understand that we're very unlikely to go back to books without pictures, I do think there is merit in them for you just and reading the recipe through and sort of imagining it how you see it, as opposed to how the food stylist saw it.
Though there's also that, I think, need for a photo for lots of people because they want to know what it's supposed to look like. I think it depends where you are on that spectrum, I think. I mean, at BBC Good Food, we'll often say like if we put chopped parsley on top, for example, you put optional because it's not, you don't necessarily need it for the dish to be great. It just, sometimes if you're cooking for people, you do want to put that little flourish on top. But yeah, we can be guilty.
An Alsace cookbook in which there was a recipe for almond trout. I won't say it in French because my French is execrable, of which the first line was, "Take your trout and stun it." I might skip that bit. But it was definitely very old school.
I bought them from Sainsbury's.
Highly amused by Elizabeth David's scorn for the humble cauliflower when the rise of cauliflower steaks now, and think, oh, she's probably doing a circle somewhere. I want to quickly touch on your book. Sorry, Felicity, go on.
I was going to say that if you look at Jane Grigson's vegetable book, which is a fantastic, sort of A to Z encyclopedia of vegetable recipes, but you won't find kale in there. She just says she's got sea kale, but then she says the other kind of kale is basically just fit for feeding to animals. And actually, kale isn't something that you really saw on menus. People might have eaten it at home because it was cheap, but you didn't see it on menus before, I don't know, about 15 years ago. And it's really interesting. There's an article, I think, in maybe the New York Times or somewhere online about the rise of kale and how sort of big kale in the States basically pushed it as a superfood. It's fascinating.
That's really interesting. I'm going to quickly touch on your fantastic book, which I'm I'm thoroughly joyously romping my way through it. Very rude. Red sauce, brown sauce. So that the opening chapter of that, the delay, and your very evocative description of the entire British Isles map spread all over your kitchen, planning your cycle route. So essentially a cycling route in search of the great British breakfast, with a side order of red sauce and brown sauce. What kicked off, as somebody who very rarely eats breakfast, perhaps once in a blue moon if I'm away and somebody else has gone to the bother of cooking it, this struck me as a very interesting concept for a book. What kicked it off, and what was the most unusual breakfast that you had on your journey?
So I bet even if you were, so even though you don't eat breakfast a lot, if you went to a hotel in this country and they didn't offer you a breakfast, would you feel slightly shortchanged, even if you didn't want to eat it? Because I feel like people do, even if they feel like they expect it. And that's what interested me about it. I wanted to do something, because I wrote a book before about sort of French classic dishes and going around France sort of eating croissants and rating them. And I was thinking, what ties British cuisine together like that? And I was thinking, should I do a tour of fish and chip shops, which was a very attractive idea? Should it be Sunday roasts? And then I thought, no, it's like breakfast is the thing that people seem to get the most passionate about. If you look online, there's all of these sort of Facebook groups and Instagram accounts devoted to rating people's breakfasts, and people going, oh, that bacon is flabby, and oh, what happened to that egg? He should be arrested and things. And I love the idea that actually you don't have to be a big foodie, you don't have to be you don't have to cook or anything to have an opinion on what the right kind of sauce is to go on a bacon sandwich and feel really passionate about it and feel like an expert. I think it's just become more than a meal to us. It's sort of part of our sort of culture, and it's evolved as well. It's not, people sometimes think of that sort of very Victorian breakfast spread, with all of the kippers and chafing dishes and things, or maybe your 1950s greasy spoon. But going around the country, I had the vegan fry up in Glastonbury. You can get halal fry-ups in Birmingham, all of this stuff. But also there's all the different breakfast things, very regional breakfast products that are still genuinely
Yes, the
popular
hog's pudding
in their
is quite
region.
something.
Exactly, but that you won't find anything, you won't. So you asked about the most unusual thing I ate, which is probably, judging from the reaction of most people I told about it, is the Welsh lava bread, which is not bread at all, but it's a seaweed puree, and really traditional, actually eaten on the whole west coast of Ireland and west coast of Scotland and things. It's so nutritious, really full of protein, but it does look like a green goo on a plate, and it does have a very seaweedy sort of taste. Fried in bacon fat, it's delicious, but people find that quite a difficult sell at breakfast time, I think. Even if they're very happy to eat sushi rolls, for lunch with seaweed, the idea of seaweed on your breakfast plate, I think, freaks people out. But it's so good for us that, that's my big tip. Try lava bread.
Excellent.
When I had a Welsh breakfast, I had cockles.
Yeah, so that's the other thing. Yeah,
and that was in your
bread.
book as well, which would never have occurred to me, to have cockles for breakfast.
It's weird the way that we segregate foods into appropriate for breakfast and not, which is quite a recent thing and quite an unusual thing around the world. Lots of cultures. I went to talk to someone about Chinese breakfast, and they were like, there's no such thing as a Chinese breakfast food. We just eat what we might eat at other times of day, but just maybe less of it. But there's no, set thing. And we very happily, I'm sure, eat cockles for lunch, or spaghetti alla vongole or something like that. But the idea of them at breakfast, for some reason, is repulsive to lots of people, and that is a really interesting thing to me. Why we've suddenly developed this taboo that only some things are suitable for eating before lunch. I'll eat anything.
Before I turn to questions, which are coming in thick and fast now, I'm going to ask you one final question, which is a sort of play on food hell, food heaven, which is, what is, do you think, the most disgusting thing you've ever been presented to eat? And also, what would be your deathbed, sort of death row favourite food to take you on your merry way?
My most disgusting is, I once ate a pig's eyeball. Sorry, I hope no one's about to eat their dinner here. And I think the worst thing about it was, it was a sort of pig in a day course, devoted to using every single part of the pig and, making black pudding and etc. And someone said, does anyone eat pig's eyes? Or, does anyone eat eyeballs? And I thought, surely around the world someone did. And so the person that prepared it had absolutely no experience. It wasn't like this was a traditional recipe from somewhere. They just thought, wonder what happens if I just sort of bread this and deep fry it. And then they said they'd eat it if someone else would. And my friend pushed me forward, and I had to, I always say I'll eat anything, so I had to try it. And it looked really delicious, because instead of it being crumbed, it looked like an arancini or something. And such was the effect of how it looked, that there was a sort of, I could see through the batter, there was a sort of blue bit. And for a moment I thought, oh, it's blue cheese. And then I realised I put it into my mouth, that was the poor pig's iris. And that was a very unpleasant thing. It's very chewy. I wouldn't recommend it as a thing. And my food heaven is really boring, actually. It is buttered toast, preferably with Marmite, but really good buttered toast. It just comfort food extraordinaire.
And Samuel?
Well, I think I had a carbs brain once, which was made by somebody incredibly talented. And actually the first half of it I quite enjoyed, but a whole brain is too much. And there's something about the texture. It's like,
it's very creamy.
It was like a jelly, like a blancmange, that I kind of, every spoonful I thought it was going to burst. And so I was kind of freaked out, as well as not particularly enjoying the texture or the flavour. And I think my food heaven would be probably a pudding, like tiramisu, or pasta. I love carbs.
Yeah.
Yes.
Carb lover.
Pasta in Italy as well would be great, by the sea.
Before my husband and I got married, and he'd been a vegetarian for a very long time, and we were in a restaurant in Bruges, and I thought, he's never going to know what lamb sweetbreads are. And so I was thoroughly enjoying them until I realised halfway through he did in fact know what they were. Rather turned me off. But certainly the most disgusting thing I have never tried, but did come around a lazy Susan a lot, was a duck's tongue attached to a beak.
Oh, yes.
Which was quite a thing. And
I think that one or two I found was fine, but they come in enormous quantities, and actually psychologically I think that maybe my limit is probably about 3, and after that I'm like, oh, this is a bit much, isn't it? No.
Now there is a very interesting set of questions here, and I'm going to kick off with one, because you are both so long in the food writing game. Some of the recipes are very similar, and this goes to the heart of your work in distilling recipes, Felicity. Is there a concept of plagiarism in food writing? I mean, do you kind of look at other people's version of a thing and say, yeah, that was mine?
There's been some quite big ones, hasn't there, recently? Some stories.
Yeah, it is interesting because basically I was going to say no, because I truly believe that almost every recipe is built upon another recipe. And like occasionally you come up with a new spin. Like once I did a cheese and Marmite donut, like a Marmite, the dough had Marmite in it for the donut, and then the filling was sort of hot molten cheese. And I was almost too scared to Google it because I'm like, someone must have done this before. But then sometimes when I'm looking, so I'm looking for 10 different versions of whatever recipe I'm doing that week. So for example, I'm doing 10 different Battenberg cakes. And when you're looking at them all side by side, you do sometimes notice that certainly some of them show very clearly that they might have drawn extremely directly and maybe just like tweaked a bit of salt or how much vanilla goes in or whatever it is. So it is a strange one because I want to say no, but sometimes people are a bit too free with just taking your recipe and reproducing it with a tiny tweak, which is annoying. It's not a legal issue. It's annoying, but Sam's right. There was a big case quite recently with a cookbook where someone had done that, and I think you'll usually get away with unless you also reproduce the recipe introductions and the stories.
Yes.
At which point people start to go, "Hang on, you can't have had the same mum as me." But I think it is a problem, especially online now, because people can just reproduce things without attribution. And yeah, I think that I'm always fine with it. If they credit me, then that's fine, because hopefully people will then be directed to more of my work and etc. But if you see your thing somewhere with no, my dal recipe is on a packet of I think Tor dal from a big company, and it's been on there for ages with no credit to me. And people keep pointing it out, and I think I need to go to them and say, "Oi, at least give me 50 quid or some free dal, please."
I mean, that's what I do. I just type Felicity Cloake's perfect, and then tweak it a little bit, and then pretend it's mine.
This could be the end of a beautiful friendship here.
Yeah, it's true. Lucky we're in different cities.
I think a lot of the problem is there's no rules around it. I think when I was at university and we did a food writing course, like a module, they just said you just have to change 3 things, which I thought was a bit of an odd thing to teach somebody.
Yeah.
But I think it's the method and the introduction that's the biggest issue. I don't, like as Felicity, I don't think any of us are really creating anything unique. At least not most of them are just new versions of something else. It's the intent, I think.
Yeah, putting 2 unexpected things together. Like I made a recipe from Easter Belfridge's new book. She used to work with Ottolenghi, and she's just one of those people that's got a really maverick food brain, which I don't think I have. I maybe put unusual things together when they're leftovers in the fridge, but that's not generally how my brain works. And it was a tomato salad, but it had, instead of croutons, it had croutons made of crumpets, and they were incredible because obviously crumpets sort of soak up. If you toss them in I think it was tossed in olive oil and garlic before putting them in the oven, they are delicious. And I love crumpets, and I'd never thought of using them for anything other than battering. Yeah. Exactly. So I think that there are sort of genuinely new concepts out there, but they usually are sort of combinations of things rather than I have just invented a whole new dish.
So second question, what food trends are you anticipating for the next year or so? And what's the strangest food trend that you've had to write about?
Oh,
I think definitely, unfortunately, as we were saying, the food trend is probably going to be, thrifty eating, and, the cost of living and etc. Which from an intellectual point of view is interesting, but from a human point of view is really sad. Yeah. The strangest food trends. I mean, I've written about some odd stuff in my time. I would say that the idea that we were all going to be, I think I wrote about back in about 2013, the idea that we're all by now going to be eating insects sort of whole and, sauteed grasshoppers and stuff. And I'm not averse to an insect. I've eaten some really delicious crunchy beetles and stuff. But I think that the British public has a way to go before we're going to be seeing that. So, yeah, I don't know what, Sam, you think's coming down the track.
Well, the one, I think it's definitely cost of living. And I think, as sad as it is that we're having to get to that point, I think it is going to be interesting. And I think it's actually going to help to shape people's cooking for quite a long time as well and learn thrifty ways. The trend that, it's not necessarily a terrible one, but was really surprised by was when I was doing air fryer recipes, and I genuinely thought I was going to hate the air fryer. And I'm a convert. I think it's great. I don't know where to put it, but it is even things like frying bacon. When you live in like quite a small environment, you pop it in the air fryer, and you don't get that smell like all over your curtains, all over your clothes.
But it's not a fryer. My problem with the air fryer is it's a really excellent, efficient, tiny oven. But if you're expecting things to come out deep fried, then you're going to be disappointed.
Yeah,
you need to rebranding.
You know what we call it?
True. You can't fry in air, but they are useful gadgets and really energy efficient.
Yeah.
Actually.
And the quality of the food's pretty good, actually, I think.
It gets really good write-ups, but I think if I buy one more kitchen gadget, there will be a serious bust-up.
No, yeah.
Chive scissors, I remember.
Yes.
Chive scissors.
Poultry scissors. I have a pair of scissors that usually are kicking around the kitchen. I wouldn't say they were poultry, but they're quite good for spatchcocking. How is social media changing food writing? Questioner says, I'm thinking of TikTok videos, Instagram reels that focus on recipes, but not tending to be by professional food writers such as yourselves. Felicity, are you going to go wild on TikTok anytime later this year? Is the BBC embracing TikTok, Samuel?
Yes, we are.
Sam actually sent me a message last week saying, when are you going to go onto TikTok? And I said, I think I'm about 20 years too old. But people are, of my advanced age and more, are on TikTok, I know. So I need to stop being such a Luddite. I think it's really interesting because a bit like, when food blogging started, in the dawn of the internet, it opens up the space to different people and not necessarily just magazines. And there's some fascinating things coming out of there. And, you see them, they eventually make it across to old person's platforms like Instagram. But a lot of them do seem to be sort of shock value things or things that I guess are just sort of curious rather than, I think there's relatively few things that actually I've looked at and thought, that looks delicious. But I really welcome the fact that it's bringing a whole new generation of people and a more diverse section of people into the game and with fresh ideas, because basically we can nick them all. So
our online food, the Guild of Food Writers Awards last night, the online food writer award went to at Cookalore, and that is an Instagram account. It's really informative. I think there's lots to be learned. It's just there's quite a lot of rubbish, I suppose. I shouldn't really say that, but there's a lot to wade through before you get to the quality.
Edited, but I find it really exciting that I can look at people all around the world and see what they're eating, and
it's the
see
connection,
what's happening
isn't
in
it?
the States, and following sort of chefs in India and whatever. I just find that absolutely fascinating. But you do have to wade through a lot of people deep frying pasta and etc.
Yes.
And I think it's when somebody's cutting through all of that, like it's not really trend focus. It's when it's just something that's catching on, and they're creating like an original piece of content that's actually really interesting. There's obviously a place for the quick reels where you just watch 3 seconds of somebody doing something, but I think that there's definitely people that have got a lot of talent on there, and the data, and there's so much data now as well that we can use. I suppose it's not really so much social media, but I think it's definitely helpful.
Well, speaking of around the world, I'm delighted to say we have at least one audience member tuning in from the States. So
hey,
I know, it's really cool. So a couple of questions broadly on, this is the career advice section when we have major time experts at festival events. So one of which is around getting into freelance proofreading and copy, advice for entry into cookery publications, particularly plant-based, says thank you for your veganized recipes. And also somebody who wants to break into food and recipe writing but doesn't have any formal cookery experience. What would a magazine like BBC Good Food and Olive look for in a potential food and recipe writer? Is the lack of formal experience likely to hold them back? Is there anything that they could be doing to prove their cooking ability?
I think it's really tricky, actually. It depends on the publication, and it depends which route you go as well. I think most people do have some kind of formal, for the magazine world, unless you're a columnist, most people do have some kind of training, whether that's like Leith's or Westminster College, or I went down the degree route. But for me, I think it's just about getting out there and trying to do as much work experience as possible. It was I lived in Bath. There was nowhere really to go, so I used to just try and do stints and sleep on people's sofa, and then try and hang out at a magazine, do some work experience. It took me a while because I wasn't that financially free to be able to not have a full-time job. But you can also apply for the entry level positions and like cookery assistants, but even the BBC Good Food Cookery Assistant has a formal qualification, but not every publication's like that.
I would also say that because I got into this by doing lots of work experience and temping and things, but I was a bit younger than you were, Sam, so I could afford to sort of sleep on floors a bit more. But I think making contacts with people in editorial, so going to do work experience, but also now a route that wasn't really open so much in those days was, you know, creating your own portfolio online. So if you happen to have a specialism, whether that's sort of vegan recipes, it sounds like, or whether that's sort of Gujarati, vegetarian, you know, whatever you think your area of expertise is, you know, creating, say, a TikTok account, an Instagram account, a blog, and showing what you can do. And I don't know, I might be wrong, but I think that if you build up a little bit of a name for yourself and a bit of a following, you've already proved that you can write recipes and you can sort of create content. And I would think that if you're doing something interesting, you know, that would probably help you in maybe a similar way to having a Leeds degree or whatever it is, because you've shown that you can deliver. So I do think that thinking about what is your USP as a recipe writer and trying to sort of get in that way might also be a good thing to do.
I think, as Felicity just said, the networking's key. Like for me, I went on a food writing course at Arvon. I don't think they do them anymore. And then there were one of the food writers was Orlando Murrin, and I kind of emailed him afterwards, and I just told, do you know anybody? And in Bristol, there's Xanthi Clay, and he put me in touch, and that's kind of how I started food styling, really, and assisting there. And I just do that at the weekends and after teaching. And you just have to kind of then be like, oh, can you put me in touch with someone else? And eventually you'll, you know, something will happen.
Yeah, but definitely use the online world to show what you can do.
Yeah, definitely.
And perhaps building out on that, there's an interesting question here around how can we make the world of food writing more diverse? It feels quite white and middle class, and I'm not sure either of the three of us are massively well qualified, but it would be interesting to know about whether you think things are becoming more diverse in terms of food writers entering into the field and being noticed and captured.
I think we've got we're you know, something that we're really trying hard with at BBC Good Food. You know, we've been doing it for a few years now, making sure that you're using an authentic voice. And it is. There are a lot of middle class white people. I mean, I'm from a working class background, and you know, we didn't have a lot of money, and it was quite hard to get into it just because it was it was easier, I think, for people that it wasn't necessarily the primary income in the house.
I was going to say that I think that is the problem with journalism in general, is that the pay is unfortunately low. And so you get the people that come in at the beginning of their career and they can afford to live with their parents or have help with their rent or whatever. But I do think that things are changing, not that the pay unfortunately is getting better, but that certainly efforts are being made. You know, The Guardian has a really diverse roster of food writers, and actually now people are being called out on it rightly. I think this is a really great time to say this. You know, you've never featured anything on, say, Ghanaian food. You know, what do you know about Nigerian food? Let me tell you, your readers should know about this. And I think that it's a fantastic opportunity to make up for the, you know, the literal very white middle classness of the food writing industry for the last, you know, forever, basically. But I think that the money is a problem, and I don't know how we solve that.
And especially, I think, freelancing. I think that, you know, you have to get a certain number of pieces of work in order to earn a good salary. And actually in publishing, from my side, is that there are fewer jobs, really. There obviously more jobs in the digital world, and now quite often you'll work across you know, all of it, but there aren't. I'm just thinking about, you know, where I used to work, there was one food team for 13 magazines, and there was between 3 and 5 of us at any one time. And years ago, that each magazine probably would have had 2 or 3 people. So you're narrowing that pool of actual job, like, you know, full-time jobs.
Yeah.
And then the freelance world isn't necessarily well paid. If you go into that social media world, then you're probably, there's chances for commercial work as well. And to be fair, freelancers like food styling can be quite well paid. Certainly if it's for commercial work as opposed to magazine facing. Magazine food styling is not badly paid either. But I think I think what's really important is we're aware of it, and there's a drive to improve it. Like even with the Guild of Food Writers, we've got like our diversity policy in place now, and we're really trying to drive that forward. And actually, last night at the awards, like the winners were really diverse, which was fantastic.
That's great to hear. So touching on television, there's a specific question here. When are we going to see Samuel on Saturday Kitchen? But perhaps I could widen it out to Felicity, you and Eddie the Bike, surely also ripe for a television series.
Can you imagine? I keep falling off the bike. Actually, no, my injuries are not the bike related. But yeah, I don't know. Television is funny, isn't it? I don't know. I have done a little bit of it, and you have to keep, I'm always in awe when I watch Nigella doing TV. She's obviously such a consummate pro. And you realise that even when she's not doing anything, when she's not speaking, when she's just chopping garlic, she's smiling. And I don't have that kind of face. So I think I'd need to practice my lovely smiley face. Yeah, I quite often get very grumpy when I'm doing stuff.
Yeah, peeling an onion is my least favourite thing. So yes, I think I'd definitely struggle. Samuel, is Saturday Kitchen about to come banging on your door?
No, I don't think so. I think I'm going to say same problem as Felicity. I don't think it's true, obviously, but I think I feel I'm a bit too dry, probably, and sarcastic. It might come across as being miserable.
Not what people want for their weekend.
Yeah, smile more. That's our lesson from today.
Two final things. This isn't a question, so I'm simply going to read it out. But Fiona says, not a question, just a big vote for Hog's Pudding. So there you go.
Yay! Fellow fan.
And then my mischievous colleague Sue Mendes is in the audience and is always good for a question. And she says, this is a question if there's time for Felicity Cloake. How dangerous is it to give a recipe for the perfect ... when the food in question is regionally controversial, e.g. the perfect Welsh cake?
I feel like this. Oh no, I haven't done Welsh cakes, I don't think. So I feel like I'm going to get off the hook here. It's really dangerous, and it doesn't matter, as I say, whether it's from Wales, whether it's from Lancashire, or whether it's from Sri Lanka. You will never be quite local enough to justify it. But I think that I hope that I get away with it just because I give lots of different options, and I kind of see my recipe as more my very own personal favorite version. But say, if you want to make this person or that person, I'm giving sort of other people a platform who are real experts. So hopefully I get away with it. But Welsh cakes are actually on the list. I love oh my God, a freshly cooked Welsh cake. So delicious. I know you're not really meant to put butter on them because they've got lots of butter or lard in them, but oh my God, with some salty butter on top, so delicious.
Samuel, have you caused regional discontent with anything that you've recalibrated?
Well, I did actually do a Welsh cake, but I didn't get any. That was one of the recipes that I thought was really good, and then it got put online and somebody gave it a really low star rating, and I got really upset. That's thin skin. No, I don't think so. I think it is really tricky because you're really aware that you don't want to do a disservice to anybody.
Because you need to honour people, culinary cultures and history and etc. So it does feel like quite a big responsibility, which I hope that I treat seriously.
I think as well we have to remember that these recipes are our versions of it. It's not, we're not trying to say that we're creating the. Well, actually, you are trying to say you're creating the perfect one, actually.
My perfect version, yes, yeah.
But it's your perfect version.
Yes,
yeah, exactly. It's I think that's what's really important is we're not. It's not the definitive. It's just our version of it that we hope somebody's going to cook and really enjoy.
Well, you both saved me endless amounts of time. So on behalf of the audience, I am very grateful for all your efforts. More power to your culinary elbow. And I look forward to continuing to read Red Sauce, Brown Sauce. I am a brown sauce girl myself, and I'm going to be trying Felicity's recipe for brown sauce when I get past the festival. Thank you both so much. That was completely fascinating. I could have talked to the pair of you all night, but we have now sadly hit the 7:00 mark. And Felicity, you look like you've got things to do as well. I'm so grateful for both of your time. It's been really fantastic. We need to get you both up in person next time round because that was just really, really great. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to all the festival festival donors that allow us to do these things for free for the audience. I'm very, very grateful. Do send the Watch Again link to all your mates, because there was lots of action-packed tips in Felicity and Sam's talk. And thank you again, everybody, and have a good rest of the night. And I hope the weather stays nice wherever you are, including in the US and elsewhere. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.